Near a giant waterfall, a humanoid alien watches a starship leave the planet before reserving a container with a black liquid that it drinks. Immediately, the liquid begins to take over his body, blackening his skin and dissolving his DNA, causing the alien to fall into the water. Its body also begins to dissolve, its DNA being carried away by the current. In the year 2089, a team of archaeologists led by Dr. Elizabeth and Charlie find some paintings in a cave in Scotland that are at least 35,000 years old. They matched a series of paintings from different cultures around the world that did not share the same information. 2 years later, they left Earth on the ship Prometheus. The entire crew is under cryosleep, and the one in charge of taking care of things is David, a robot. He uses his free time to learn more about being human, such as playing sports, watching movies, cutting hair, and learning ancient languages. He also likes to spy on the crew's dreams. For example, Elizabeth had a dream about the time she was a little girl and saw an African tribe burying one of their own. Her father had to explain to her how each culture had different beliefs when it came to death. After 2 years of travel, the ship reaches its destination, and David awakens the entire crew, consisting of mercenaries and scientists. Everyone gets time to recover from the side effects and get some food on their empty stomachs, though Captain Janek also puts up a Christmas tree because they miss the holidays. This is seen as dumb by Meredith, the person in charge of overseeing everyone doing their job properly. Soon the mission brief begins, and Meredith plays a holographic recording of Peter, the CEO of the Wayland Corporation, the company that funded the expedition. He explains that by the time they see it, he's already dead, and David is the closest thing to a son he'll ever have. Peter has always wanted to know where we come from and what happens when we die, so he finances the expedition, while Elizabeth and Charlie come up with a theory. The doctors take over the floor and draw a star map explaining the paintings they found around the world that can lead them to a planet with its own sun that can sustain life, and that's where they are now. They believe the map was placed by some aliens Elizabeth calls the engineers, because her theory says they are the ones who created mankind, though the rest of the crew is skeptical. Moments later, Meredith calls the doctors to come to her private quarters, which has her own medical pod and self-contained life support. Meredith explains that she doesn't believe the cave scribbles meant anything, and that she's doing it for Peter. Thus, it's her responsibility to make sure the money isn't wasted. If the medics find life, they are forbidden to communicate, which makes the medics wonder why they even came. David has spent the past 2 years deconstructing dozens of ancient languages, and is convinced he can communicate with the engineers. But when he sends a message to the planet, no one responds. The crew decides it's time to land, and the ship passes through the atmosphere, detecting no radio signals or heat sources, meaning there is no civilization here. However, Charlie notices some straight line on the ground that doesn't happen naturally, and the ship lands on that spot. The crew prepares to go on an expedition, and David dons a suit, even though he doesn't need it, because he was designed to blend in with humans. The team takes a series of cars to see a dome-like structure that geologist Fifield can't say is natural, but he's sure it's hollow. Once they're inside, Fifield sends out 2 special probes that map the entire area, allowing them to find their way through multiple corridors. As they go deeper, they find a source of water that is heated by sunlight and has acceptable CO2 levels. Although it is completely toxic on the outside, it seems to be breathable on the inside. Charlie guesses that these aliens were terraforming and risks removing his helmet, making sure it's perfectly fine. Everyone then removes their helmets to continue exploring, and David finds a wall with a strange goo and various symbols, which he activates for his knowledge of language. This results in a sudden hologram of figures running through the corridors, and the crew follows them until they find the body of an alien lying next to the door that killed him. Fifield could tell that things were getting dangerous, and a geologist would not be needed, so he and biologist Milburn decided to return to the ship. While the doctors examine the body, David manages to open the door, and they find the alien's head on the other side in a state of excellent preservation. The rest of the crew finds more corpses, indicating that the species is extinct. There are worms in this room. It's possible to see life, but also a monolith of a human head, a ceiling mural, and a bunch of stone cylinders. David notices that the cylinders are sweating, and soon a black organic substance begins to ooze out of them. Elizabeth doesn't notice as she watches the murals, which begin to change. She thinks they've affected the atmosphere in the room, and they need to leave, so she and Charlie start bagging the head to take away, while David steals a cylinder after he concludes that the cave is a tomb. At that moment, Janek discovers that a dangerous storm is approaching, and calls the doctors to warn them, giving them 15 minutes to make it back before Meredith closes the ramp. The crew exits the cave and drives as fast as they can, returning to the ship just in time. However, the alien's head falls from the car, and Elizabeth goes back to grab it, causing Storm to hit her and enter the ship. Charlie tries to rescue her by driving through the air, but she too gets stuck, and eventually David pulls them in with a set of cables. The crew then set to work decontaminating their bodies in the hangar, only to discover that Milburn and Fifield had not yet returned. It appears that 2 scientists are lost inside the cave. Janet contacts them and explains that they can't pick them up because of the storm, which means they have to wait until morning. Meanwhile, the team sterilizes the head, and a quick scan reveals reveals it's not an exoskeleton, it's a helmet. When they open it, they find a humanoid alien head inside with new cells changing in the forehead, so they decide to run a stem line into his brain to make it look alive. The trick works, and the facial gestures begin, but things quickly go wrong, and overstimulation causes it to explode. Elizabeth takes a closer look at the sample taken from his head, and is delighted to discover that its DNA matches that of a man, meaning that her theory was correct, and that these boys created the human race. Meanwhile, David goes to give an update on a cryosleep pod that contains a mysterious person. No one knows about it except Meredith, who violently demands to David what the man said. David only said they were told to try harder. David then goes to inspect the cylinder he personally brought, and inside he finds a bunch of capsules containing a black liquid. This gives him an idea, and he decides to meet up with Charlie to share a drink, as they wonder how far they can go to get the answer they want. Later, Charlie joins Elizabeth in her room, and she shares the news about the DNA, so they celebrate with excitement. In the cave, Milburn and Fifield are looking at a gruesome pile of alien corpses when they suddenly receive a call from Janek, who warns them that the scanner has detected signs of life nearby. The scientists start to worry, but just like that, the ping on the scanner disappears, and Janek attributes it to a glitch. Eventually, Milburn and Fifield come across the room with the monolith and see black liquid pouring out of the cylinder. To their surprise, they find a reptilian-type alien swimming in the liquid, and when Milburn approaches, the creature attaches to his arm and tries to break it. Fifield cuts the creature to help him spray the alien's corrosive liquid on his helmet, which eats through the plastic and reaches his mouth. As Fifield writhes in agony, the creature enters Milburn's suite and kills him. The next morning, Charlie wakes up feeling sick and notices something strange in his eye. Janek calls everyone to tell them that the storm has passed, but he can't contact the scientists, so they go looking for them. His men also didn't find the flaw in the scan, thus David promises that he will find the probe and fix it. While the group explores the cave, however, David purposefully stays behind and makes his way, sending a recording of what he sees to Meredith. He finds another room filled with thousands of cylinders and alien armor, then leads down a corridor to a chamber with a bunch of cryosleep capsules. David cuts off Meredith before activating a machine in the middle of the room that shows him holograms of engineers looking at a star map that includes Earth. When the show ends, David notices that a cryosleep capsule is burning because it still has a live engineer inside. Meanwhile, Charlie wanders during their search, and Elizabeth notices that he is ill, but she continues anyway. When they finally find Milburn's body, they approach to inspect it, and the little reptilian alien jumps away. Yet Fifield is nowhere to be seen. At that point, Charlie starts to feel really sick, so Elizabeth tells everyone to go back to isolate Charlie. When they return to the ship, Charlie's skin begins to blacken, and Meredith meets them in the hangar with a flamethrower in hand, because she doesn't want Charlie on the ship. Janek and Elizabeth start arguing with him, but Charlie thinks he has no future, and walks up to Meredith to toast her to the ground, while Elizabeth looks on in agony. Moments later, the crew is separated, and David runs a test on Elizabeth to check that Charlie hasn't infected her. To their surprise, the scan showed her to be 3 months pregnant, which is impossible because she was cryosleep 3 months earlier. The fetus also has a horribly odd shape, and Elizabeth wants it, but David points out that they don't have the means or staff to perform such surgery. Elizabeth suddenly has a terrible stomachache, so David gives her some sleeping pills. A few minutes later, a few crew members wake Elizabeth up to take her to a cryosleep capsule until they can decide what to do with her fetus. Elizabeth refuses to keep the thing, and fights everyone before running away until she finds Meredith's medical pod. She asks for a cesarean, but for some reason the pod is only calibrated for men and can't do it, so Elizabeth asks for a foreign body extraction instead. The machine accepts this and gives him some anesthetics, but they are not strong enough, and he still experiences excruciating pain as a claw removes the strange fetus from his body. The embryo immediately pops, and a monstrous alien emerges from it, which begins shaking its tentacles in an attempt to free itself. Elizabeth faces the attack while the machine closes his wound, but as soon as the stitches are done, she releases the pod and locks the alien inside, putting it to sleep with the anesthetic. Meanwhile, Janek notices something strange standing in front of the ship, and one of the crew members goes to check. It turns out to be a mutated Fifield, who starts attacking everyone in the hangar. A fierce fight ensues between all the men, and since the bullet does nothing to Fifield, they use the flamethrower to kill him. Elizabeth wanders around the ship until she comes to the infirmary for medicine, and there she's surprised to discover Peter still alive. He was there for the extra cryosleep David was talking about, and the medical pod was for him. Peter wants to meet his maker directly and wants answers, so David takes him to the engineer he found in the cave. Elizabeth tries to explain that the planet is dangerous and not what they thought, but her warnings are ignored. Unwilling to give up, Elizabeth pushes through her pain and suits up to return to the cave. Janek finds him and points out that this cannot be the engineer's home planet. The cave was probably some military installation where they were making the black liquid as a weapon of mass destruction that leaked and killed them. Janek wants to return to Earth, but Elizabeth convinces him to wait until he contacts the remaining surviving engineers. Peter is also getting ready to leave, and Meredith arrives to try to stop him from dying in a pit, as Meredith calls him Daddy, but Peter ignores her warnings as well. When the crew arrives at the cave, David tells everyone to take off their helmets because he knows the disease isn't in the air, implying that he was the the one who put the black liquid in Charlie's drink. As the crew arrives at the new room with thousands of cylinders and David calls it the cargo hold, this new scan angle allows Janek and Meredith to realize that this is not a cave, but a starship. David activates the machine as he explains that the engineers were in the process of leaving for Earth when they lost control of the black liquid that killed them. The last engineer wakes up, and Elizabeth tries to ask some questions, but Peter is stopped by one of his mercenaries before he can start asking philosophical questions of his own. David translates into Proto-Indo-European, but the engineer responds by taking David's head and using it to kill Peter. He then pushes Elizabeth away to kill the mercenaries who are wasting bullets on her. Back on the ship, Meredith sees Peter's death through David's eyes and orders Janek to get things ready to leave the planet. Elizabeth escapes while the engineer activates his own ship to fly to Earth as well. This opens up several spaces in the ground, and Elizabeth jumps through them as she calls Janek to stop the engineer, or the black liquid will come to Earth and destroy humanity. The Prometheus is not a warship, and Meredith thinks they should just leave without doing anything, but Janek ignores her and orders his pilots to heat up the ion propulsion, which will transform the ship into a bullet. Meredith escapes the ship, and Janek allows his pilots to do the same, but the pilots respect their captain and want to go down with him. Within seconds, both ships are crashing through the air, successfully stopping the engineer from leaving. However, the ships now fall to the ground, and Elizabeth and Meredith have to escape before they are crushed. Meredith is not fast enough and dies, but Elizabeth manages to survive by finding cover next to a rock. Elizabeth then goes to Prometheus to get some supplies and hears some noises inside. Grabbing an axe to defend himself, he goes to investigate and discovers that his alien offspring have escaped the medical pod and grown to a gigantic size. At that moment, David contacts Elizabeth and tells her to run, but it's too late. The engineer shows up and pushes Elizabeth against the wall to kill her. Elizabeth thinks quickly and opens the door behind her, releasing the alien child, who immediately pounces on the engineer. As Elizabeth flees, her descendant shoves an egg down the engineer's throat, subduing him. Outside the ship, Elizabeth has a breakdown when suddenly contacted by David, who explains that the engineers have more ships underground and that he can pilot them. Elizabeth goes to retrieve both David's head and body, but she has a request. Instead of returning to Earth, she wants to go to the engineer's home planet, and David agrees, even though he doesn't understand why she's so desperate for answers. Before David and Elizabeth leave the planet in an alien ship, Elizabeth returns to Prometheus one last time and sends a message to Earth that explains. Moments later, a black alien emerges from inside the dead engineer, confirming that this story is a precursor to Ripley's story.